Throughout human history, certain individuals have risen to power not with promises of hope or prosperity, but through the blunt instruments of fear, violence, and crushing oppression. These are the ruthless leaders who commanded vast empires, instigated global conflicts, and instilled a breed of terror so profound that it left behind a grim and bloody legacy. Today, we are exploring the 10 most brutal dictators to ever walk the earth. These are figures whose actions brought unimaginable suffering to millions and altered the fabric of human civilization. This list ranks these despots based on the sheer scale of their brutality, the absolute extent of their power, and the devastating human suffering they caused. We will evaluate their dictatorships through hard data, the impacts of their atrocities, and the undeniable cruelty they unleashed through mass executions, sweeping genocides, and the systematic destruction of entire societies. Part 1. The Dawn of Terror and the Last King of Scotland. We begin our descent into darkness with number 10, a man whose very name became synonymous with African autocracy and unhinged terror. In 1971, the nation of Uganda was thrown into an absolute tailspin. A towering and charismatic former military officer named Idi Amin seized control of the country through a ruthless military coup. He ousted the sitting president by rolling tanks into the capital city of Kampala and seizing the government by absolute brute force. Almost immediately, Amin began to dismantle any semblance of democracy, replacing it with a paranoid and hyper-violent police state. He declared himself the absolute ruler. Eventually, he adopted a string of absurd and grandiose titles, most famously styling himself as the Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, and the last King of Scotland. But behind the theatrical public persona, the military medals pinned to his chest, and the booming, boisterous laughter was a cold-blooded butcher who viewed human life as entirely expendable. For 8 agonizing years, his word was the only law that mattered. Amin cultivated a deeply ingrained culture of fear, utilizing a fiercely loyal network of soldiers and secret police known as the State Research Bureau. These enforcers operated completely above the law and were known for their sadistic conduct, dragging civilians directly out of their beds. If you spoke out against the government, or if you simply belonged to the wrong ethnic group, you disappeared without a trace. Entire communities were subjected to arbitrary arrests, horrific torture, and public executions designed to send a chilling message to anyone who might harbor thoughts of resistance. He specifically targeted the Acholi and Lango ethnic groups, viewing them as loyalists to the former president, and ordered the systematic slaughter of their soldiers and civilians alike. During his dark era of rule, the cruelty of his dictatorship reached absolute extremes. He orchestrated the violent expulsion of Uganda's Asian population, ordering roughly 80,000 people of Indian and Pakistani descent to leave the country with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They were given just 90 days to pack up their belongings and abandon the only homes they had ever known, leaving behind lucrative businesses, massive estates, and generational wealth. This xenophobic decree resulted in a catastrophic economic collapse because the nation lost its core merchants, doctors, and tradesmen in one fell swoop. But the economic ruin paled in comparison to the sheer volume of blood spilled on Ugandan soil. His soldiers dumped the bodies of political dissidents, rival tribal members, and ordinary citizens into the Nile River to be devoured by crocodiles. This practice became so widespread that the water literally choked with human remains, clogging the intake ducts of the hydroelectric dam at Owen Falls. The international community watched in absolute horror. Uganda had descended into a slaughterhouse, yet Amin paraded himself before the world press with arrogant defiance. By the time his government finally collapsed in 1979, the staggering cost of his megalomania was laid bare for the world to see. Tanzanian forces and Ugandan exiles stormed Kampala, forcing the dictator to flee the country. For the rest of his life, he resided in comfortable exile in Saudi Arabia. He never faced a courtroom or answered for his crimes. The estimated death toll from his purges ranges from 100,000 to 500,000 innocent men, women, and children. Amin had promised his people a utopia, but instead, he delivered a waking nightmare. His brutal reign proved how easily a nation could be swallowed whole by the madness of a single man. This horrific legacy set a grim stage for the other despots on our list. Part 2. The Nationalist Nightmare of Spain. We move from the jungles of Uganda to the blood-soaked soil of Western Europe for number 9 on our list. In the 1930s, the world watched in horror as Spain tore itself apart in a vicious and polarizing civil war. The streets of Madrid, Barcelona, and Guernica ran red with the blood of brothers fighting brothers in a brutal ideological struggle between democracy and fascism. Out of the smoke and rubble of this devastating conflict emerged a man who would systematically crush the spirit of an entire nation. His name was Francisco Franco, a ruthless and deeply conservative military general who took command of the nationalist forces. By 1939, Franco had emerged victorious, successfully overthrowing the democratic Second Spanish Republic with the heavy backing of fascist allies in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. At the close of the war, the defeated Republicans hoped for peace, but the true nightmare for the Spanish people had only just begun. Franco installed himself as the absolute dictator of Spain, establishing a brutal fascist regime that demanded total and unwavering obedience to his singular vision of the state. For the next 36 years, his iron-fisted rule transformed the vibrant, culturally rich nation into a suffocating ideological prison. His government systematically dismantled every conceivable political freedom, crushing labor unions, outlawing all opposition parties, and completely silencing the free press. The dictator viewed his political opponents not just as rivals, but as a literal disease that needed to be violently purged from the Spanish bloodstream. His military strength rested on a well-equipped, fiercely loyal army and a heavily militarized police force that operated with absolute impunity. While the historical Spanish Inquisition had been officially abolished in the 19th century, Franco's modern enforcers resurrected its terrifying and fanatical methods to hunt down dissidents, intellectuals, and anyone deemed an enemy of the traditional Catholic state. In the dead of night, suspects were dragged from their homes, thrown into cold interrogation rooms, subjected to unspeakable physical torture, and forced into false confessions. During the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, a distinct and bloody era known as the White Terror, his regime orchestrated the mass execution of hundreds of thousands of Republicans and suspected sympathizers. From dawn to dusk, executioners and firing squads worked relentlessly, filling unmarked mass graves scattered across the barren countryside. Those who were lucky enough to escape the bullet were often thrown into squalid concentration camps. Others were forced into grueling penal labor battalions, ordered to rebuild the very bridges, railways, and monuments the fighting had destroyed, working under the lash of their captors. Franco's brutality extended far beyond the barrel of a gun and the confines of a labor camp. His regime utilized a terrifying strategy of psychological warfare, including the forced disappearance of thousands upon thousands of political opponents. Men and women were essentially erased from existence. They were swallowed by the state apparatus, leaving their grieving families with no answers, no bodies to bury, and absolutely no legal recourse. Even more chilling was the widespread, state-sanctioned theft of the innocent. From the very moment of birth, countless infants were systematically stolen from the arms of Republican mothers in state hospitals. Doctors and nurses complicit in the regime would falsely tell the mothers that their babies had died. These stolen offspring were then handed over to wealthy, loyalist families to be raised under strict fascist ideology. This was a deliberate, calculated tactic designed to literally breed the opposition out of existence and ensure the ideological purity of the next generation. The true scale of the carnage and human suffering under his watch is absolutely staggering. Historians estimate the death toll of his brutal regime to be anywhere from 200,000 to 400,000 innocent lives, though the exact number of the vanished may never be fully known. Until his death in 1975, Francisco Franco ruled over a fractured and deeply traumatized nation. He refused to answer for the rivers of blood he had spilled. He left behind a deeply scarred society, proving the terrifying reality that some of the most ruthless dictators managed to hold their iron grip until their final breath. Part 3. The architect of Italian fascism. We now turn our attention to the Mediterranean, where a charismatic journalist turned ruthless demagogue would birth an ideology of pure state control and drag his country into the darkest depths of the 20th century. In the aftermath of World War I, Italy was a nation completely paralyzed by economic ruin, violent labor strikes, and a deep sense of national humiliation. From this boiling cauldron of political chaos emerged Benito Mussolini, a fiercely ambitious man who recognized that a fractured society was desperate for a savior. He formed a paramilitary force known as the Blackshirts, a violent mob of disgruntled veterans and street brawlers who enthusiastically smashed labor unions and beat his political rivals into submission. By 1922, Mussolini had organized a massive march on Rome, demanding absolute power and successfully intimidating a weak monarchy into handing him the reins of the government. He immediately began tearing down the democratic institutions of Italy brick by brick. He declared himself Il Duce, the supreme leader, and established the world's very first fascist dictatorship. Under his rigid new system, the state was elevated above everything else, and the individual mattered absolutely zero. For 21 years, Mussolini ruled Italy with a suffocating iron fist, completely outlawing all opposition parties and relying on his brutal secret police force to maintain order. Anyone brave enough to question his authority was swiftly silenced. Political opponents were routinely dragged out of their homes, subjected to humiliating and agonizing torture, or shipped off to desolate island penal colonies where many were simply left to rot. But Mussolini's megalomania could never be contained within the borders of his own country. He was obsessed with the delusional fantasy of reviving the glory of the ancient Roman Empire, and he was more than willing to drown foreign lands in blood to achieve it. In 1935, Mussolini launched an unprovoked and savage invasion of Ethiopia. His military forces deployed horrific tactics against a largely outgunned African nation. Italian bombers rained down hundreds of tons of illegal mustard gas on Ethiopian soldiers and defenseless civilians alike, blinding, burning, and suffocating tens of thousands of people. When local populations dared to resist the occupation, his generals ordered sweeping massacres, slaughtering entire villages and executing religious leaders to instill absolute terror. As the late 1930s approached, the architect of fascism made his most fatal mistake by forging a blood-soaked alliance with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. This disastrous pact eventually dragged the Italian people headfirst into the meat grinder of the Second World War. He sent hundreds of thousands of ill-equipped Italian soldiers to die freezing in the snows of Eastern Europe or burning in the deserts of North Africa. By 1943, his grand imperial dreams had completely collapsed. The Allied forces invaded the Italian mainland, reducing historical cities to absolute rubble and turning the country into a chaotic and bloody war zone. The death toll of his grand delusions is absolutely staggering. Historians estimate that 400,000 to 500,000 lives were lost directly due to his brutal domestic repression and his relentless wars of conquest. He left his nation completely shattered and deeply divided. The architect of fascism eventually met a gruesome end at the hands of his own furious citizens, a stark reminder that dictators who live by the sword often face a merciless reckoning. Part 4. The Agrarian Killing Fields. We leave the ruins of Europe and travel to the dense jungles of Southeast Asia for number 7 on our list. Here, a radical communist revolutionary orchestrated an experiment in social engineering so extreme and so completely deranged that it shattered a nation to its very core. His name was Pol Pot, the architect of the Khmer Rouge and a man who sought to drag his entire country backwards into an agrarian utopia. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge marched into the capital city of Phnom Penh, and immediately began one of the most drastic and violent forced migrations in human history. Soldiers emptied out the hospitals, schools, and homes at gunpoint, forcing millions of urban dwellers to march into the sweltering countryside to work in massive agricultural labor camps. Money, religion, private property, and even family ties were completely abolished almost overnight. Pol Pot envisioned a pure, classless society of peasant farmers, but his twisted vision quickly transformed Cambodia into a massive, nationwide concentration camp. For 4 agonizing years, the people of Cambodia were subjected to unimaginably brutal conditions. Men, women, and children were forced to toil endlessly in the rice paddies, subsisting on nothing but watery porridge. Starvation and rampant disease became the daily reality for millions. As the regime exported the little food, they grew to fund their military ambitions. But hunger was only one weapon in the arsenal of the Khmer Rouge. The regime harbored a deeply paranoid hatred for anyone they perceived as an intellectual or a threat to their absolute control. Teachers, doctors, engineers, and even people who simply wore eyeglasses or possessed soft hands were routinely rounded up and slaughtered. Ethnic minorities and religious leaders were hunted down and exterminated without a shred of mercy. The secret police established a terrifying network of torture centers, most notably the infamous security prison 21, where thousands of innocent people were brutally interrogated, mutilated, and forced into false confessions before being hauled off to their deaths. Prisoners were transported to the notorious killing fields, where soldiers, desperate to save valuable ammunition, bludgeoned them to death with farm tools, iron bars, and the blunt edges of machetes. From 1975 to 1979, the scale of the carnage was almost beyond human comprehension. During this era of absolute terror, an estimated 1.7 to 2 million people were murdered, representing roughly a quarter of the entire Cambodian population. The soil of the nation was literally soaked in the blood of its own citizens, leaving physical and psychological scars that would haunt the survivors for generations. In 1979, the nightmare finally came to a halt when Vietnamese forces invaded the country and sent Pol Pot fleeing back into the jungle. He left behind a landscape of mass graves and a broken society, securing his horrific legacy as the mastermind behind one of the most thorough and devastating genocides in modern history. Part 5. The Red Famine and the Cultural Purge. We now leave the killing fields of Cambodia and look to the massive expanse of East Asia for number 6 on our list. Here we find a founding father whose grand vision for a communist utopia resulted in the highest death toll attributed to a single leader. His name was Mao Zedong, the architect of the People's Republic of China. For 27 years, his absolute authority over the world's most populous nation brought about catastrophic suffering, starvation, and relentless ideological purges. In 1949, after a brutal and exhausting civil war, Mao and his Red Army stood victorious, completely reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the globe. He consolidated power with an iron grip, demanding total loyalty to his communist ideology and crushing anyone who dared to oppose his new regime. The sheer scale of his military strength and domestic control allowed him to implement radical social experiments that would doom tens of millions of his own people. During the late 1950s, Mao launched a disastrous socio-economic campaign known as the Great Leap Forward. He sought to rapidly transform China from an agrarian economy into an industrial superpower by forcing peasant farmers into massive agricultural communes. Private farming was strictly prohibited, and communities were ordered to produce steel in backyard furnaces instead of growing crops. This completely deranged policy resulted in a catastrophic drop in food production. What followed was one of the largest and most devastating man-made famines the world had ever seen. Tens of millions of men, women, and children slowly starved to death as the government callously exported grain to maintain the illusion of economic success. Whole villages were wiped off the map by hunger, and desperation drove the surviving peasants to eat bark, roots, and eventually each other. In the 1960s, Realizing his grip on power was slipping due to the utter failure of his economic policies, Mao unleashed another wave of unimaginable terror. He initiated the Cultural Revolution, a violent socio-political movement designed to purge the country of traditional elements and eliminate his political rivals. He weaponized the youth of China, organizing them into radical paramilitary groups known as the Red Guards. These indoctrinated teenagers roamed the streets with absolute impunity, publicly humiliating, torturing, and murdering teachers, intellectuals, and anyone perceived as a threat to the communist state. Historical artifacts were smashed to dust, books were burned in massive pyres, and families were encouraged to betray one another to prove their loyalty to the state. The psychological trauma inflicted upon the Chinese population during this dark era was absolutely profound, creating a society paralyzed by suspicion and constant fear. By the time Mao Zedong died in 1976, his legacy was cemented in mountains of human skulls. Experts estimate that a staggering 40 million to 70 million people perished as a direct result of his brutal campaigns, mass executions, and devastating famines. He built his modern state on a foundation of unimaginable suffering, leaving a deeply scarred nation in his wake. Part 6: The Man of Steel and Mass Terror. We journey from the famine-stricken plains of China to the freezing, desolate expanses of the Soviet Union for number 5 on our countdown. Here, a paranoid and deeply ruthless revolutionary transformed a massive nation into a totalitarian meat grinder. His name was Joseph Stalin, a man who literally adopted the title Man of Steel to project an aura of absolute, unbreakable power. In 1924, following the death of Vladimir Lenin, Stalin began his brutal ascent to absolute supremacy over the Soviet Union. He did not possess the intellectual brilliance of his peers, but he was a master of political manipulation and bureaucratic backstabbing. For 29 years, he ruled with a level of paranoia and cruelty that defied human comprehension, cementing his legacy as one of the most prolific mass murderers in human history. He built a cult of personality so pervasive that citizens were forced to hang his portrait in their homes and sing his praises while his secret police actively plotted their demise. During the late 1920s, Stalin enacted a ruthless policy of rapid industrialization and forced agricultural collectivization. He essentially went to war with his own peasantry. Independent farmers, known as kulaks, were declared enemies of the state. His heavily armed enforcers swept through the countryside, stripping families of their land, their livestock, and their grain. When the farmers resisted, they were lined up against walls and shot, or packed into freezing cattle cars and shipped off to the frozen wastelands of Siberia. This catastrophic theft of agricultural resources resulted in a devastating, man-made famine that swept across Eastern Europe. In the early 1930s, the horror reached its absolute apex in Ukraine, an event known today as the Holodomor. Millions of Ukrainian men, women, and children slowly starved to death as Stalin explicitly ordered military blockades to prevent any food from entering the region. People were driven to absolute madness by hunger, eating grass, tree bark, and eventually resorting to the unthinkable horror of cannibalism. While millions of his own citizens decomposed in the streets, Stalin callously exported millions of tons of grain to foreign markets to fund his massive industrial complexes. But starvation was only one instrument in his symphony of terror. Stalin was completely consumed by the delusional fear that his political allies were actively plotting against him. From 1936 to 1938, he unleashed the Great Purge, a campaign of political repression and murder so vast that it decimated the upper ranks of the Communist Party and the Red Army. No one was safe from his paranoid wrath. His notorious secret police, the NKVD, arrested millions of ordinary citizens under completely fabricated charges of espionage and sabotage. In cold, damp interrogation rooms, innocent people were brutally beaten until they signed false confessions, often implicating their own friends and family members just to make the torture stop. A simple joke about the government, or a petty grudge held by a neighbor, was a guaranteed death sentence. Those who were not immediately executed with a pistol shot to the back of the head were absorbed into the Gulag system. This was a massive, sprawling network of forced labor camps that stretched across the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Prisoners were forced to mine gold, chop timber, and build massive infrastructure projects with primitive hand tools while enduring sub-zero temperatures and severe malnutrition. Millions of souls vanished into the freezing white oblivion of these camps, worked entirely to death for the glory of the Soviet state. During World War II, his absolute disregard for human life was put on full display as he directed a vast Red Army against the invading forces of Nazi Germany. He famously issued orders that any Soviet soldier who retreated from the front lines was to be immediately gunned down by their own commanders. Victory was achieved, but it was paid for with an ocean of Soviet blood. By the time of his death in 1953, Stalin had completely reshaped the Soviet Union, but he did so by leaving behind an unfathomable mountain of corpses. Historians estimate that his regime was responsible for the deaths of 20 to 60 million people. He left behind a traumatized, fractured society, proving that the man of steel was forged entirely in the fires of human suffering. Part 7. The Mastermind of the Holocaust. We leave the frozen wastelands of the Soviet Union and return to the heart of Europe for number 4 on our list. Here we find a failed artist and deeply embittered veteran who weaponized the despair of a broken nation to orchestrate the deadliest conflict in human history.
Oh God, it's falling!
His name was Adolf Hitler, the architect of Nazi Germany and a man whose absolute hatred pushed the entire world to the absolute brink of destruction. In 1933, Hitler legally ascended to the position of Chancellor of Germany, capitalizing on the severe economic ruin and national humiliation left in the wake of the First World War. Almost immediately, he began tearing down the democratic framework of the Weimar Republic. Through violent intimidation, brilliant propaganda, and political maneuvering, he dissolved all opposition parties and declared himself the supreme leader, or Führer. He mesmerized massive crowds at the Nuremberg rallies, using theatrical lighting, a sea of swastika flags, and booming, hypnotic speeches to whip the German populace into a frenzy of blind fanaticism. He brainwashed the youth of the nation, teaching children to worship him as a god and to eagerly betray their own parents to the secret police. He transformed Germany into a rigid totalitarian state, enforced by the terrifying brutality of the Gestapo and the Schutzstaffel. These ruthless paramilitary organizations hunted down political dissidents, labor leaders, and anyone who dared to speak out against the Nazi regime. But political repression was only the opening act of his deeply twisted vision for the country. Hitler was completely consumed by a toxic and pseudoscientific ideology of racial purity. He blamed the Jewish people for the economic failures of Germany and systematically stripped them of their citizenship, their businesses, and their basic human rights. In 1938, this hatred exploded into violent public action during the Night of Broken Glass. Nazi stormtroopers and ordinary citizens alike marched through the streets, shattering the windows of Jewish businesses, burning historic synagogues to the ground, and beating innocent people to death in the open. This horrific pogrom signaled the true beginning of his campaign of absolute annihilation. The virulent anti-Semitism of the regime culminated in the Holocaust, an industrialized, state-sponsored genocide of unparalleled scale and horrifying efficiency. Men, women, and children were forced into overcrowded ghettos, stripped of their dignity, and eventually packed into suffocating cattle cars. They were transported to extermination camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, where they were systematically murdered in massive gas chambers. The Nazis brutally extinguished the lives of 6 million Jewish people, along with millions of Romani people, people with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, and other innocent civilians deemed undesirable by the state. In 1939, Hitler unleashed his formidable military machine, the Wehrmacht, across the border into Poland. This unprovoked invasion officially ignited the Second World War. His forces utilized a revolutionary and terrifying military strategy known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war, completely overwhelming neighboring nations with rapid, concentrated attacks of armor and air power. Cities across Europe were reduced to absolute rubble as the Nazi war machine marched relentlessly forward. Hitler demanded total subjugation, bringing widespread death, starvation, and devastation to every single territory his armies occupied. For 12 agonizing years, his reign of terror plunged the globe into a nightmare of bloodshed and destruction. By 1945, the Allied forces had pushed deep into German territory, completely surrounding the capital city of Berlin. Rather than face a courtroom or answer for his unspeakable crimes against humanity, the mastermind of the Holocaust cowered in his underground bunker and took his own life. The sheer scale of the carnage he left behind is almost impossible to comprehend. Historians estimate that his direct policies of extermination resulted in 17 to 20 million deaths. Furthermore, the global war he instigated claimed the lives of roughly 70 million people worldwide. He left behind a continent in absolute ruins and a legacy of pure, unadulterated evil that will forever stain the pages of human history. Part 8. The God King of the Hermit Kingdom. We leave the smoldering ruins of Europe and travel to the divided Korean peninsula for number 3 on our list. Here, a former guerrilla fighter constructed a regime so fiercely isolated and intensely brainwashed that it earned the title of the Hermit Kingdom. His name was Kim Il-sung, the founding leader of North Korea and a dictator who literally fashioned himself into a living god. In 1948, the northern half of the peninsula officially became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim installed as its supreme leader by the Soviet Union. Almost immediately, he began forging a society built entirely around his own image and absolute obedience to the state. He cultivated a totalitarian regime that aggressively crushed any dissenting voices. In 1950, Kim Il-sung launched a devastating surprise invasion of South Korea, igniting a brutal and bloody conflict that would draw in global superpowers. For 3 agonizing years, the Korean War ravaged the peninsula, reducing cities to ash and claiming millions of civilian and military lives. By 1953, the fighting ground to a violent stalemate, ending in an armistice rather than a peace treaty. In the decades that followed, Kim Il-sung completely sealed his nation off from the rest of the world. He implemented a radical philosophy known as yucha, or self-reliance, which plunged the country into severe economic isolation. His citizens were completely cut off from outside information. He instituted a personality cult so pervasive that his portrait hung in every single room, and citizens were required to wear pins bearing his face over their hearts. From a very young age, children were taught to revere him as a flawless, benevolent father figure. But behind this meticulously crafted facade of a socialist paradise was a terrifying apparatus of state-sponsored terror. Kim was intensely paranoid about political rivals and launched brutal purges that eliminated thousands of officials and perceived enemies. Entire families were held responsible for the alleged crimes of a single relative. If a man spoke out against the regime, he and his entire extended family would be forcibly taken away by the secret police. These innocent people were packed into freezing train cars and shipped to a massive network of hidden political prison camps known as the Kwanliso. Within these desolate gulags, prisoners were subjected to horrific torture, forced labor, and severe starvation. Men, women, and children were worked to the bone in hazardous coal mines and logging camps until they simply dropped dead from exhaustion. Food was so scarce that prisoners resorted to catching rats and insects just to survive. The military strength of the nation ballooned as Kim poured the meager resources of the country into a heavily armed force, laying the groundwork for a dangerous nuclear weapons program while his own people slowly starved. For 46 years, Kim Il-sung maintained an iron grip over every aspect of North Korean society. When he finally died in 1994, he left behind a deeply impoverished, heavily militarized, and completely traumatized nation. He is officially recognized by the state as the eternal president, ensuring his oppressive shadow continues to blanket the country long after his passing. Estimates suggest his relentless purges, labor camps, and resulting famines caused 1 to 3 million deaths. His brutal legacy secured his position as one of the most ruthless and enduring dictators in modern history. Part 9. The Butcher of Baghdad. We leave the isolated borders of North Korea and travel to the ancient, oil-rich sands of the Middle East for number 2 on our list. Here, a ruthless political enforcer rose through the ranks of the Ba'ath Party to seize total control of Iraq, transforming the nation into his personal slaughterhouse. His name was Saddam Hussein, known to the world as the Butcher of Baghdad. In 1979, Saddam orchestrated a massive and terrifying purge of his own political party to officially claim the presidency. He called a meeting of hundreds of Ba'ath Party officials, locked the doors of the auditorium, and calmly sat behind a desk, smoking a cigar while names of alleged traitors were read aloud. One by one, men were dragged from their seats by armed guards and taken outside to be executed. They were often forced to be shot by their own surviving colleagues to ensure absolute loyalty through shared blood. This chilling event broadcasted a clear message to the Iraqi people. Saddam Hussein ruled through absolute terror, and nobody was safe from his wrath. For 24 years, he maintained his iron grip by employing a sprawling network of secret police who operated out of notorious torture centers. Dissidents, journalists, and everyday citizens who whispered a word against him were subjected to unspeakable horrors. Victims were hung from ceilings, beaten with cables, and subjected to electric shocks. Meanwhile, their families were entirely left in the dark about their fates. His paranoia and thirst for regional dominance pushed Iraq into a series of catastrophic conflicts. In 1980, hoping to capitalize on the chaos of the Iranian Revolution, Saddam ordered a massive invasion of neighboring Iran. This sparked a brutal, trench warfare conflict reminiscent of previous global wars. For 8 agonizing years, the conflict consumed the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides. Saddam callously deployed chemical weapons, including mustard gas and nerve agents, against Iranian troops. This proved he had absolutely no regard for international law or human decency. But his cruelty was not reserved solely for foreign enemies. During the late 1980s, Saddam turned his weapons of mass destruction inward against the Kurdish population of northern Iraq. He launched the Anfal campaign, a systematic and genocidal military operation designed to crush Kurdish resistance and erase their culture. On March 16, 1988, Iraqi warplanes dropped a deadly cocktail of chemical weapons onto the Kurdish town of Halabja. Within hours, the sweet-smelling gas choked the life out of roughly 5,000 innocent men, women, and children. The Anfal campaign resulted in the destruction of thousands of villages and the slaughter of up to 100,000 Kurds. Their bodies were bulldozed into mass graves in the desert. In 1990, driven by massive war debts, Saddam ordered his military to invade the small, oil-rich nation of Kuwait. This blatant act of aggression triggered a massive international response and led to the Gulf War. Though his forces were quickly expelled by a United States-led coalition, Saddam violently crushed the subsequent uprisings of Shiite Muslims and Kurds within his own borders. He drained the southern marshes to deliberately starve and displace the marsh Arabs. For generations, these people had thrived in the wetlands, but he wiped out their entire way of life. Until his eventual capture in 2003, his regime stood as a monument to human cruelty. The Butcher of Baghdad was finally put on trial by his own people and executed, but his reign of terror left an indelible scar on the Middle East. Historians estimate that his brutal wars, domestic purges, and genocidal campaigns resulted in the deaths of 250,000 to 1 million people. He built a regime purely on violence, demonstrating the horrifying lengths to which a dictator will go to preserve his own absolute power. Part 10. The Scourge of the Steppe. We have reached the final spot on our countdown. During the 12th century, the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe were locked in a constant, bloody cycle of betrayal and warfare. From this chaotic era emerged a single warrior whose unmatched brutality and military genius would completely alter the trajectory of human history. His name was Temujin, but the world would come to fear him as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler and the founding father of the Mongol Empire. In the year 1206, after violent campaigns of tribal unification, he was officially declared the supreme leader of all Mongols. For 21 years, his absolute reign unleashed a terrifying wave of conquest that swept across the globe like a force of nature. Genghis Khan revolutionized the art of war, commanding a highly mobile and strictly disciplined army that grew to roughly 200,000 mounted archers. He pioneered the use of terrifying psychological warfare, sending emissaries ahead of his advancing horde to offer a simple, chilling ultimatum to foreign kings. If a city surrendered immediately, they would be spared and absorbed into the growing empire. If they dared to resist, the punishment was absolute and total annihilation. When sieges dragged on for days or weeks, the Mongol forces would literally wipe entire civilizations off the map once the walls finally fell. They would storm the breached defenses and slaughter every single man, woman, and child inside, sparing only a handful of skilled artisans to work for the horde. The devastation was so complete that the Mongols would often redirect rivers to flood the ruins of the cities they had just burned to the ground. He ruthlessly used captured civilians as human shields, driving innocent people forward to soak up the arrows of their own defenders before his heavy cavalry even engaged. During his massive campaigns into China, the Khwarezmian Empire, and Eastern Europe, the death toll reached apocalyptic levels. The streets of conquered capital cities ran red with blood, and the severed heads of the defeated were piled into massive, terrifying pyramids outside the ruined gates. By the year 1227, Genghis Khan had forged the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But this unparalleled achievement was paid for with a mountain of corpses so vast that the massive depopulation of farming regions actually allowed forests to regrow and altered the global climate. Historians estimate that his merciless campaigns resulted in the deaths of 40 million to 70 million people, wiping out roughly 10% of the entire global population. Genghis Khan leaves behind a legacy of unmatched conquest and unspeakable bloodshed, securing his dark place as the most brutal and devastating dictator to ever walk the earth.
The Achaemenid Empire, vast and diverse, was organized into these distinct satrapies, or provinces, to ensure efficient rule.